Open with a haunting, atmospheric scene of Amarna under the scorching sun, with shadows stretching across deserted temples and the remains of once grand monuments. The camera, or in this case, the narration, moves slowly through the empty courtyards, echoing with the ghostly whispers of a forgotten age. Introduce Akhenaten, the pharaoh who defied millennia of tradition, daring to replace Egypt's pantheon of gods with a single deity, Aten, the sun disk. Describe the stark contrast between his revolutionary vision and the entrenched, conservative forces of the Egyptian priesthood and nobility, emphasizing how radical his experiment was. Set the scene with vivid imagery, the shimmering sands that conceal secrets, the crumbling walls adorned with faded reliefs showing a smiling, almost alien-looking king with his family, and the sense that history itself has tried to erase him. Introduce the central mystery: why has Akhenaten's reign been so vilified, ignored, or misunderstood? Compare him subtly to the famous Tutankhamun, whose tomb became a global sensation, creating a tension between fame and obscurity, between what we know and what has been deliberately forgotten. Build suspense by hinting at the erasure of Akhenaten, temples dismantled, records altered, names struck from history. Question the motivations: was it political revenge, religious zeal, or something even more sinister? Suggest that the answers lie buried beneath layers of myth, manipulation, and lost records, compelling the audience to join the journey of discovery. Introduce psychological hooks, emphasize the eerie parallels between Akhenaten's radical reforms and patterns of rebellion or heresy throughout history. Suggest that understanding his story could reveal not just ancient secrets, but universal truths about power, belief, and the fragility of human memory. End this section with a cinematic transition. As the narrator steps out of the ruins, the camera pans toward the horizon, the sun blazing in the sky, symbolizing both the worship of Aten and the blinding nature of historical omission. Pose the question that will guide the script: to uncover Akhenaten's true story, we must sift through the sands of time, through myth and manipulation, to find the man behind the mystery. This section establishes tone, mood, and stakes, setting the audience up for the journey ahead while maintaining curiosity, suspense, and contrast between fact and mystery. Provide historical context of Egypt before Akhenaten's reign. Highlight the religious, political, and cultural structure dominated by the pantheon of gods and the powerful Ammonius priesthood. Contrast the stability of traditional Egypt with the brewing tension that would allow Akhenaten's radical reforms. Introduce the audience to the conventional life of pharaohs, the significance of Thebes, and the rituals that defined Egyptian kingship. This sets up a dramatic contrast for the revolutionary changes Akhenaten will attempt. Include subtle foreshadowing of the rebellion he would face and the mystery surrounding his motivations. Before Akhenaten's radical vision reshaped the Nile Valley, Egypt thrived under centuries of tradition. The land was dominated by an intricate tapestry of gods, each ruling over aspects of life and death, harvest and fertility, war and peace. Ammonius, the hidden god whose power had grown quietly behind temple walls, loomed large over the political and spiritual heart of Thebes. The priests of Ammonius wielded influence that rivaled the pharaohs themselves, controlling wealth, land, and the very narrative of divine favor. To the average Egyptian, life was a rhythm of devotion, rituals at dawn, offerings at dusk, prayers for prosperity and protection. The pharaoh, though unquestioned in authority, was far from absolute. His image was carefully crafted through ceremonial splendor, grand monuments, and inscriptions that tied him directly to the gods. The throne passed through dynasties that revered continuity, stability, and cosmic order. Every action of the ruler reinforced a delicate balance between heaven and earth, and the pharaoh's legitimacy relied on this intricate harmony. Yet beneath the golden veneer, tension simmered. The priest's wealth grew unchecked, the power dynamics within the court shifted subtly with each passing generation, and whispers of dissatisfaction rippled among the people. Daily life in Egypt revolved around the Nile. Farmers labored in predictable cycles of planting and harvest, their work guided by the solar calendar and the phases of the moon. Artisans, scribes, and merchants supported the sprawling urban centers, creating a society as intricate as the hieroglyphs etched into temple walls. Despite this apparent order, Egypt was on the brink of change. New ideas, political, religious, even philosophical, lurched through the corridors of power, challenging centuries of orthodoxy. In this world, the pharaoh's role was as much about appeasing gods as it was about asserting control over men. Rituals were meticulously performed to maintain Ma'at, the divine order. Any disruption risked chaos, famine, or civil unrest. And yet, it is precisely within such a rigid system that seeds of revolution could quietly germinate. The stage was set for a king who would question everything, a ruler whose ambitions would confront tradition and provoke rebellion, yet whose motivations remain shrouded in mystery to this day. Egypt before Akhenaten was a land of contrast, divine order and human intrigue, wealth and vulnerability, reverence and quiet discontent. By understanding this world, we glimpse the magnitude of the upheaval Akhenaten would bring, and the dangers of defying a civilization that had, for centuries, perfected the art of balance. Akhenaten's rise to power was anything but ordinary, marking a turning point in ancient Egyptian history. Born Amenhotep IV, he was thrust into a world dominated by centuries-old traditions and powerful priesthoods that controlled both religion and politics. From an early age, Akhenaten showed signs of a ruler who would not follow the established path. His fascination with the sun disk, Aten, was more than mere curiosity, it hinted at a vision that would challenge the very foundation of Egyptian belief systems. As he ascended to the throne, Akhenaten's marriage to Nefertiti became both a personal alliance and a political strategy. Nefertiti was not only his partner but also a co-conspirator in the audacious spiritual transformation he envisioned. Together, they began promoting a monotheistic worship of Aten, a radical departure from the polytheistic pantheon that Egyptians had revered for millennia. Temples dedicated to Ammonius, the traditional god, were increasingly sidelined, and Akhenaten's decrees demanded a shift in religious devotion. This was not a simple religious reform, it was a cultural upheaval. Priests who had long held immense power were now threatened, and whispers of dissent began to circulate. Tomb inscriptions and contemporary records portray a pharaoh convinced of a divine mandate, yet one whose reforms were seen as heretical by many. The tension between Akhenaten and the established priesthood grew, setting the stage for conflicts that history would barely document, leaving modern scholars to piece together the fragments of a kingdom on the brink. Amid this religious revolution, Akhenaten founded a new capital, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, designed to reflect his spiritual ideology. The city itself was a marvel of sunlight and geometry, built to honor Aten above all else. It was isolated yet radiant, a symbol of the pharaoh's devotion and the physical embodiment of his radical vision. Everyday life in Akhetaten revolved around this sun-centered worship, and the city became a laboratory for Akhenaten's revolutionary ideas. The section also explores the psychological dimensions of Akhenaten's rule. Was he a visionary ahead of his time, driven by a genuine belief in a singular deity? Or was his zeal a political maneuver to consolidate power by undermining the entrenched priesthood? Evidence is murky, but the narrative should immerse viewers in the uncertainty, drawing them into the mystery. Art from the period, elongated figures, unusual depictions of the royal family, reflects the uniqueness of his reign and hints at deeper, perhaps even esoteric, intentions. To build suspense, the section concludes with foreshadowing of Akhenaten's eventual isolation and the fragility of his reforms. Despite the grandeur of Akhetaten and the devotion of his followers, the tension with traditionalists and the enigmatic nature of his spiritual doctrine left his legacy vulnerable. By juxtaposing the brilliance of his vision with the shadow of imminent conflict, this section sets the stage for the unfolding drama of his reign and the enduring mysteries surrounding his life and decisions. Dive into the creation of Akhetaten, the pharaoh's city of the sun. Describe its architecture, open courtyards, and temples dedicated solely to Aten. Highlight archaeological discoveries that reveal both grandeur and eerie emptiness. Contrast this city with the bustling, traditional power centers of Egypt. Introduce unexplained aspects of Amarna, unfinished monuments, mysterious inscriptions, and abrupt abandonment. Emphasize cinematic imagery, sunlight reflecting off limestone, shadows stretching across deserted streets, to deepen suspense. Foreshadow the enigmatic disappearance of Akhenaten's tomb and the later erasure of his memory. When Akhenaten rose to power, he envisioned a city unlike any Egypt had ever seen. Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, was designed as a living testament to Aten, the sun-disk deity. Unlike the dense, labyrinthine streets of Thebes or Memphis, Akhetaten sprawled openly along the Nile, with long, straight avenues lined with massive limestone buildings that gleamed in the relentless desert sun. Courtyards and open plazas created a feeling of liberation, as if the city itself breathed in the sunlight that was both its heart and its god. It was a city built on a radical belief, that all power, all life, came from the sun alone. Archaeologists who excavated Amarna centuries later found both awe-inspiring grandeur and eerie silence. Monumental palaces and temples towered above the city, yet many were left unfinished, with chisels still embedded in the stone and inscriptions that stopped abruptly, as if the builders had vanished mid-thought. Statues of Akhenaten depicted the pharaoh in elongated, almost alien proportions, his features strange to traditional Egyptian eyes, another sign of a ruler intent on rewriting not only religious practice but the very image of royalty itself. The streets, when first uncovered, were hauntingly empty. Clay tablets and small artifacts hinted at a thriving population once bustling through these avenues, yet now only fragments remained, scattered and weathered. Scholars speculate, was the city abandoned due to famine, plague, or political backlash? Or did Akhenaten's radical reforms provoke a slow, deliberate erasure by those who came after him, determined to restore the old gods and their traditional power structures? Even the religious architecture of Amarna holds its mysteries. The great temple of Aten, open to the sky, allowed sunlight to pour directly onto altars in precise patterns. Was this a simple act of devotion, or did these alignments conceal knowledge of astronomy, cycles, or secrets now lost? Everyday life in Amarna, from workshops to the workers' villages, reflected a culture in transition, teetering between innovation and instability. As dusk fell over the desert, shadows stretched across the city, elongating the monuments in ways that could almost make them appear alive. There is a palpable sense of disappearance, a cinematic emptiness that whispers of secrets still buried beneath the sands. The sudden abandonment of Amarna and the later erasure of Akhenaten's memory from Egyptian history cast a long shadow, leaving modern explorers and historians to wonder, what did the sun god himself demand of his people, and what truths were so dangerous that later generations sought to obliterate them entirely? Akhenaten's religious revolution was unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. Where centuries of tradition had worshipped a pantheon of gods, he demanded devotion to a single deity, Aten, the sun disk. This was not merely a political maneuver, it was a seismic shift in the spiritual fabric of the kingdom. Imagine the shock of priests, accustomed to centuries of ritual, now sidelined, stripped of their influence, and witnessing the dismantling of temples that had stood for generations. The streets of Thebes, once alive with the familiar chants and ceremonies, fell into an uneasy silence. Akhenaten positioned himself as the sole mediator between the people and Aten, a bridge between the mortal and divine. Every decree, every architectural choice, every public image reinforced this connection. Statues of the pharaoh and his family, elongated and almost otherworldly in appearance, stared down from temples bathed in sunlight. Scholars debate whether this was purely an artistic innovation or an intentional effort to signify his otherworldly bond with Aten. Some suggest these depictions were designed to unsettle, to make the ordinary appear divine, to enforce his authority through subtle psychological influence. The social consequences were immediate and profound. The established priesthood resisted, fomenting tension and discontent, yet the people, curious and awed, were caught between fear and fascination. Egypt's economy, heavily reliant on temple wealth, was thrown into disarray as resources were redirected to Akhenaten's new capital, Akhetaten. This city rose like a sun-scorched jewel in the desert, a bold experiment in architecture, theology, and urban planning, designed to reflect the light of Aten in every avenue and courtyard. Its isolation from the rest of Egypt was no accident. It created a crucible in which Akhenaten's ideas could flourish, sheltered from traditional oversight. Yet, behind the grandeur, there was mystery. Ancient texts hint at secret rituals conducted in the private chambers of the pharaoh. Was Akhenaten engaging in practices meant to commune directly with Aten, bypassing human intermediaries entirely? Or was this carefully orchestrated spectacle, a calculated performance of divinity meant to consolidate power? Some theorists suggest he may have possessed knowledge of celestial events, using astronomical phenomena to reinforce the impression that he alone was chosen. His family, too, was drawn into this cosmic narrative. Queen Nefertiti, often depicted alongside him in intimate, almost egalitarian poses, was not merely a consort but an essential participant in the religious spectacle. Their children, framed as divine heirs, were living symbols of Aten's favor. Yet there is an unsettling tension in the art and inscriptions, a hint that the pharaoh's radical beliefs carried emotional and psychological weight, both on himself and those around him. The court may have revered him, but it also lived under the strain of his revolutionary vision. What makes Akhenaten truly enigmatic is this duality: he was at once a visionary and a heretic, a ruler whose ideas were centuries ahead yet dangerously destabilizing. His story blurs the line between genius and fanaticism, between faith and obsession. In the shadows of Akhetaten, in the sunlit corridors of temples devoted to a single god, one is left to wonder, was Akhenaten a prophet chosen by Aten, or a man whose ambition masqueraded as divine insight? The truth may never be known, but the legacy of his experiment continues to intrigue, haunt, and challenge everything we think we know about power, belief, and the fragile boundaries between them. The story of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who dared to upend centuries of Egyptian tradition, is not only one of radical reform but also of whispered curses and ominous shadows that lingered long after his death. Known as the heretic king, Akhenaten abandoned the centuries-old worship of Ammonius and other gods, elevating Aten, the sun disk, as the sole deity. While this radical shift fascinated historians, it terrified his contemporaries. Temples were abandoned, priests were silenced, and the intricate web of political and religious power that had defined Egypt was abruptly dismantled. Scholars argue that this upheaval created instability in the kingdom, but ancient texts hint at something more, a curse that might have followed those who tried to erase Akhenaten from history. Accounts from later Egyptian dynasties suggest a deliberate attempt to obliterate his memory. Statues were smashed, inscriptions chiseled away, and even his capital city, Akhetaten, was left to crumble into the desert sands. Could this relentless destruction have sparked the idea of a curse? Ancient scribes described sudden misfortunes striking those who were close to the pharaoh, mysterious illnesses, and premature deaths among officials who had once thrived under his reign. Was it politics, divine anger, or something unexplainable? Modern historians attempt to rationalize these tales. Could famine, disease, or political purges explain the high mortality and sudden disappearances? Some suggest that the rapid changes Akhenaten imposed destabilized the food supply, weakened governance, and left the kingdom vulnerable to internal strife. But every scientific explanation clashes with the eerie coincidences recorded in temple inscriptions and royal annals. The line between historical fact and myth blurs, inviting speculation. Did the gods themselves exact revenge on those who challenged centuries of sacred tradition? Archaeological discoveries intensify the mystery. Skeletons found in Amarna, the capital of Akhenaten, show evidence of illness and malnutrition, but some graves are inexplicably empty or disrupted, as if something, or someone, had intervened. Even the art of the period reflects an unsettling preoccupation with death, the afterlife, and divine judgment. Akhenaten's portrayal, elongated and almost alien, hints at a consciousness that defied ordinary human understanding, a king who was both revered and feared in ways that transcended the tangible world. The legend of the curse persists today among those who study Egypt's lost dynasties. Writers, explorers, and even modern archaeologists report a haunting sensation when visiting the ruins of Akhetaten, as though the winds whisper secrets of angered gods and forgotten rulers. Could this be imagination, or are the echoes of the heretic king's wrath still tangible across millennia? The story invites viewers to confront the unsettling possibility that history, even when studied meticulously, may conceal forces beyond human comprehension, and that some legacies, no matter how thoroughly erased, never truly die. The story of Akhenaten reaches its darkest chapter in this section, where the grandeur of his reign clashes with the harsh reality of rebellion and erasure. Akhenaten's vision of monotheism, centered on the sun disk Aten, had reshaped Egypt politically, culturally, and spiritually. But radical innovation came at a cost. The priests of Ammonius, whose influence had been eclipsed by the new order, quietly conspired with discontented nobles. Tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface now erupted. As Akhenaten continued his radical reforms, opposition grew, spreading like a shadow over the sunlit courts of Amarna. Cinematic storytelling immerses the audience in the dramatic reversal of fortune. Visualize the abandoned corridors of Amarna, once filled with vibrant art and hymns to Aten, now echoing with silence and decay. Temples stripped of their inscriptions, statues defaced or thrown to the sands, and cities slowly falling into obscurity, the physical manifestation of a historical erasure. Contrast the radiant optimism of Akhenaten's architectural innovations with the creeping shadows of rebellion. The audience feels the tension, the clash of visionary ambition against the relentless machinery of tradition and political survival. The return of the old gods under Tutankhamun signals the triumph of conservative forces. The priesthood, no longer marginalized, reasserted their power, systematically destroying the remnants of Akhenaten's legacy. The narrative emphasizes the psychological drama of this historical cleansing, names chiseled from monuments, faces of pharaohs erased from reliefs, and temples abandoned to the desert winds. The erasure was not merely political, it was almost metaphysical, as if the Egyptians themselves sought to wipe from memory the radical experiment that had briefly challenged the divine order. Mystery deepens when the fate of Akhenaten's remains is considered. Some suggest he was quietly buried in an unmarked tomb, others propose destruction or relocation to prevent any cultic veneration. This section weaves in the tantalizing contrast between certainty and speculation, archaeologists' fragmented evidence versus the tantalizing gaps in historical records. Viewers are drawn into a detective-like investigation, tracing clues through rubble, inscriptions, and fragmentary documents, trying to reconstruct a story deliberately obscured by time. Transitions maintain suspense, linking the past to the present, desert winds carrying whispers of rebellion, sand-strewn ruins hinting at forgotten rituals, and the fading echoes of hymns that once celebrated Aten. The tone shifts between awe for Akhenaten's innovation and dread at the destructive consequences of his choices, creating a rhythm that keeps viewers engaged. The section closes with a lingering question: had Akhenaten's vision truly failed, or was it simply buried, waiting to be rediscovered by those willing to read the silence between the stones? For centuries, the name of Akhenaten was nothing more than a faint whisper in the records of Egypt. Ancient scribes had deliberately erased him from king lists, chiseling his likeness from temple walls, burying his memory under centuries of sand. And so, until the 19th century, the world had almost forgotten that this heretic pharaoh had ever lived. That all began to change when modern archaeology arrived in the Nile Valley, armed with curiosity, tools, and an unrelenting hunger to uncover what lay beneath the desert silence. The rediscovery of Akhenaten's world came not through a single dramatic moment, but through a slow unraveling of evidence. In the 1820s and 1830s, European explorers roaming the sand stumbled upon strange ruins at a site locals called Amarna. The columns, half buried in drifting dunes, bore inscriptions that did not match the usual praises of Ammonius or Osiris. Instead, they contained references to an unfamiliar god, the sun's disk, the Aten. The strangeness puzzled scholars, but it was only the beginning. By the late 19th century, excavations intensified. Archaeologists uncovered entire stretches of the once-forgotten city of Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. What they found shocked them. This was no ordinary Egyptian capital. The layout of Amarna was different, its art radical, almost modern in its naturalism. Reliefs showed the royal family in intimate scenes, Akhenaten kissing his daughters, Nefertiti sitting by his side, images that felt strikingly human, almost alien compared to the stiff hieroglyphic tradition of earlier dynasties. Among the sands also emerged unfinished temples and collapsed houses, still littered with everyday objects, pottery, tools, jewelry. These relics gave researchers a glimpse into a city that had thrived for barely 20 years before being abandoned, frozen in time like a ghost town. One of the greatest finds came in the form of the Amarna letters, clay tablets inscribed with diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and other Near Eastern kingdoms. These letters spoke of a troubled reign, of foreign leaders negotiating with Akhenaten, sometimes pleading for military aid he never gave. It painted a picture of a pharaoh more obsessed with religious devotion than with defending his empire. Yet with every discovery, more questions surfaced. Why had Akhenaten's successors worked so hard to obliterate his memory? Why were statues smashed, temples dismantled, his name cursed? Some archaeologists believed it was purely political, a backlash against his radical rejection of Egypt's traditional gods. Others sensed something darker, that Akhenaten had unlocked forbidden knowledge, something his successors feared to leave behind. In the 20th century, digs continued, pulling from the desert tombs not just broken statues but fragments of skeletons. Some believed they had located Akhenaten's own remains, though the bones were fragile, deformed, and disputed among scholars. Was this the body of the heretic pharaoh, or a misidentified relative? The mystery only deepened, fueling sensational headlines and theories about alien bloodlines, genetic experiments, or curses guarding the truth. As the dust was brushed from shattered walls and the sun revealed faces unseen for 3 millennia, archaeologists found themselves not only resurrecting Akhenaten's story but standing on the edge of a riddle that refuses to be solved. For every artifact unearthed in Amarna, there remains an echo, a silence, a question still buried beneath the sands. What else lies hidden, waiting to rewrite history once again? Akhenaten's reign was brief compared to the grand scale of Egypt's dynasties, yet his shadow stretches far beyond his lifetime. Though the pharaoh's monuments were dismantled, his name chiseled out of records, and his images smashed into dust, fragments of his vision linger stubbornly across history. What made this heretic king so dangerous that his very memory had to be erased? And why do whispers of his radical ideas still resurface in discussions of religion, art, and even extraterrestrial contact? To understand his legacy, we must first look at the world he left behind. After Akhenaten's death, the priests of Ammonius reasserted their power, restoring the old gods and traditions. His successor, likely the boy king Akhenaten, who soon changed his name to Tutankhamun, was manipulated into abandoning the Aten cult, returning Egypt to the familiar pantheon of deities. On the surface, it seemed as though Akhenaten's revolution had been completely reversed. But beneath the sand, the traces remained. Consider his art, the elongated faces, androgynous bodies, and intimate family portraits he commissioned. These images were unlike anything the rigid Egyptian canon had ever produced. Centuries later, scholars would marvel at their dreamlike, almost surreal quality. Was Akhenaten trying to show himself as both man and god, bridging the earthly and the divine? Or was he hinting at something stranger, perhaps a hidden knowledge about the nature of existence itself? Now comes the most tantalizing layer of speculation. Some researchers have drawn connections between Akhenaten's monotheism and the rise of later faiths. Could the pharaoh's devotion to a single solar deity have planted the seed of monotheistic thought long before Judaism, Christianity, and Islam took shape? Sigmund Freud himself theorized that Moses may have been influenced, directly or indirectly, by Akhenaten's ideas. If true, it would mean this heretic king was not just a forgotten ruler, but a hidden architect of global spirituality. But there is another thread woven into his legacy, one far more mysterious. Ancient astronaut theorists point to the peculiar depictions of Akhenaten and his family, their almost alien-like features, as possible evidence of otherworldly contact. Were his reforms inspired not merely by philosophy, but by something he encountered, something the priests feared so much they tried to erase it from history? Mainstream Egyptology dismisses this as fantasy, yet the strangeness of his art and doctrine continues to invite these questions. In the modern world, Akhenaten has become a figure of fascination in occult circles, esoteric writings, and speculative documentaries. Some see him as a visionary ahead of his time, a prophet of unity and higher truth. Others view him as a tyrant who imposed his obsession on a civilization not ready to embrace it. Either way, his presence persists, haunting the edges of history like a riddle no one can fully solve. And so we are left with the paradox of Akhenaten, destroyed, yet immortal. Forgotten, yet unforgettable. Was he merely a failed experiment in power, or the torchbearer of an eternal flame, one that still flickers in the hidden corners of human memory. The story closes with a reflection that blends fact, speculation, and imagery. This is not just an ending, but a final pull into the psychological undercurrent of the mystery. Expanded content, almost equals 600 words. History often claims to be permanent, etched into stone and memory. But the saga of Akhenaten reminds us how fragile that permanence really is. Here was a pharaoh who dared to break with centuries of tradition, who raised a new god above all others, who moved Egypt's very capital to fulfill his vision. Yet within a generation, his name was chiseled out, his images smashed, his memory condemned to oblivion. And still, here we are, thousands of years later, speaking his name. The paradox is chilling, the very act of erasing him may have made him immortal. Like a forbidden word, Akhenaten's story survived precisely because it was silenced. The curse, if there was one, was not just supernatural, it was psychological. It infected Egypt's rulers, historians, and even us, compelling us to ask, why was he so dangerous? Why was his memory more threatening than his life? As we reflect, the tension between myth and reality sharpens. Was Akhenaten a visionary ahead of his time, a prophet of monotheism before the world was ready? Or was he a heretic who nearly unraveled Egypt's stability? The truth hides in fragments, statues with elongated skulls, half-buried reliefs of a radiant sun, whispers in ancient texts. Archaeology gives us shards of evidence, but imagination fills the gaps. That's where mystery thrives. Picture the scene, the ruins of Amarna at dusk. The city once alive with hymns to Aten now lies silent, half swallowed by the desert. Sand drifts through roofless halls where courtiers once bowed. The sun sets, the very god Akhenaten worshipped, casting long shadows that stretch across the broken walls. It feels almost as if the city itself is holding its breath, waiting for secrets that will never be told. And yet, despite the silence, the memory lingers. Every attempt to destroy him has instead deepened the mystery. Was this erasure an act of political control, or a recognition that some knowledge, some truths, are too dangerous to preserve? Was Akhenaten cursed, or was Egypt cursed for trying to forget him? What remains is not certainty, but questions. Can we ever truly know the man behind the myth? Or are we forever chasing shadows, our minds haunted not by what we find, but by what was lost? Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of Akhenaten. History is not only about what is remembered, but also about what is deliberately forgotten. So we close with a final image. The camera lingers on the horizon over Amarna, the sky bleeding orange and red as night falls. The desert wind stirs the sand. Somewhere beneath it, untouched tombs may still rest, holding answers, or only more riddles. The line between history and legend blurs, and the mystery persists. Because in the end, Akhenaten's story is not just about a pharaoh. It is about us, our hunger for meaning, our fear of forgetting, our fascination with those who dare to break the rules. Some mysteries, it seems, are never meant to be solved. They are meant to echo, whispering through time, luring us back again and again.